right. Welcome back to the Gravity Podcast. We're here today with my friend, Simeon Schnapper. Simeon, it is awesome to see you. Your big, smiley, happy face and just, awesome to have a chance to do this with you.
Likewise. Pleasure.
Yeah, good. So let's start at the beginning. Talk to me about kind of early childhood, your memories of what your life was like, your family dynamics, where you're from, any of that really important early stuff.
Geez. Early life. How many hours do we have?
Yeah, we'll move through it. And I know life is really full, really full. It's a big question to start with, but just kind of tell me like what you remember about being a kid. What was life like for you? What were your parents like? Tell me more about where you were, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I had the benefit of having two really awesome parents. My dad was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers in Nigeria. And my mom was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers in Ethiopia. And then they met when they became Peace Corps directors, training other Peace Corps volunteers in Mogadishu in Somalia. So that's kind of always been a big part of early life where, quote unquote, I was a Peace Corps baby. So the earlier years were various countries, with the last one being Western Samoa, an island of Apia. And as I recall, my dad, who I still recall in like a lava, which is like a sarong, and like a beard, and never wearing a shirt, and walking to get, pails of water because there wasn't necessarily running water or electricity all the time, and bringing that back to the home. One day he thought, maybe this isn't the best place to raise a kid or kids. I have an older brother, and we weren't feeling so great. I think I was always like covered in mosquitoes, and my brother wasn't feeling so hot. And kind of overnight, we relocated to Chicago, Illinois. I remember walking outside of my bedroom, and there was this dude in the hallway, a shaven man with like a three-piece suit. And I remember going, "Mom, who is that?" And she's like, "That's your dad." And it was his first day post-Peace Corps of working at Cyril Pharmaceuticals. It's a big pharmaceutical company in the suburbs, as the head of organizational development, with a direct report who at the time was Donald Rumsfeld. So my whole orientation shifted kind of in a single day from, oh, wait, I'm this baby running around jumping into the ocean, to, oh, now I'm living in Chicago and my dad's a suit.
How old were you?
God, I was like 5-ish. I mean, enough so that the memory is still ingrained.
Yeah.
The whole early life, with the parents were, they just continued that whole ethos of Peace Corps, even if they were going a little more corporate, at least my dad at that point. And my mom also continued her work. She became president of the AAEJ, which was the American Association for Ethiopian Jewry, and helped to mastermind one of the biggest humanitarian airlifts in history, Operation Solomon, where they basically evacuated a bunch of Falashas, which are Ethiopian Jews, considered like the first Jewish tribe, from Ethiopia during the coup d'etat of Mengistu to Israel. So growing up, the African influence was always there. And I don't think there was ever a day in early childhood life where there was not a refugee, either sleeping in a sleeping bag at the end of my bed or, in the basement. yeah, I mean, up until teen years, I honestly, I can't remember a time where there was not, my mom and dad both doing all this great humanitarian work and opening up our home to, you know, asylees, immigrants, refugees, mostly from, the time they had spent in East and West Africa, respectively. So it's a pretty uh, colorful childhood in that respect. It was also in Rogers Park, Illinois. So it's the north side of Chicago, which I think till this day is still considered, one of the most ethnically diverse neighborhoods in the world. So even in like grammar school, like, hey, mom, I'm going to go to, what's his name's house after school. Um, and just from a cuisine perspective, like the difference of African to Haitian to Moroccan, Filipino food was, just a big part of early childhood.
Yeah. And so tell me, what do you recall about like how you were being, at that time? So I hear, what you're observing, um, fascinating, right? And having parents that are so committed to the world and to other people, and seeing your dad make that shift into corporate America, what happens to you as a kid? What are you interested in? What kinds of things are you doing? What path do you start to go down, at those early ages?
Yeah, I got really into theater. I just loved doing plays and performing. I think, was I a lion? It's a blurry memory. No, I wasn't a lion. I think I was like a shrub in some Jewish community centers, like Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe adaptation. But I just loved that was a lot of early childhood and into my teen years and into adult years. Just film and theater and whatever happens when you're with a group of people in an ensemble. So yeah, I was just doing a lot of plays. I always like to make people laugh, whether it was class clown or creative writing or whatever plays you could do at that time in Chicago. And that was a focus. I think when people asked when I was growing up what I wanted to be, it was like actor, writer, director. That was always my thing. And the joke now, fast forward, decades later, primarily doing business, I can attribute a lot of the listening and give and take and empathy and success there from, the roots in the theater. And it might just be one of the best characters I've ever played, that of a businessman.
Interesting. Yeah. So tell me, kind of as you start to move through childhood and kind of, into your very early adult life, this idea of playing the role of a businessman, I mean, we can kind of fast forward a bit and circle back. I mean, your life really does seem to have kind of all come together around the work that you're doing now. But were there any other kind of like business aspects that were coming in as a kid? Were you entrepreneurial at all? Or was it really more this kind of idea of how to perform or a way to kind of be with various different people that you were learning in that, kind of acting theater world?
A little bit of both, I think. I mean, as I reflect back on just early entrepreneurial pursuits, like in grade school, like, hey, can I buy a candy bar for $1 and sell it for $2? I've just always had this inherent entrepreneurial bent of how does this work? How do businesses work? How does society work? How does commerce work? How does finance work? That was there pretty early. And then in teen years, started doing just different entrepreneurial ventures and kind of liked the idea of it as as a way to communicate with people as well. I think the performance thing, to some extent, and even not so much performance, but just the theater itself, somewhat took a backseat in the teen years. And definitely as I moved forward into, college, where, I just started doing, startups early on. And there's still probably a little part of me that, still yearns for, like, there's something, I don't know, maybe it was around like late teens where I started to do tech stuff and business stuff. And there was a part of me that said, well, let me do this. And I'll come back to the theater and the film and everything else. And a day became a week, and a week became a month. And then several years went by, and I hadn't done a play in a decade. It managed to make a feature film in between. But the business world just kind of overtook everything, and entrepreneurial pursuits overtook. Even if there was, great creativity in the business and using a lot of the same theater games and skill sets as a part of it. But yeah, I didn't expect this to be psychotherapy, but I'm reflecting on, there was some period where I just said, I'll get back to it. I'll get back to it. Let me do this business.
And do you have a sense as to what it was that was kind of calling you into the business world? Why was it that you were willing to kind of put that on the back burner? What was it about kind of the business piece that was drawing you there?
Well, I know I loved it. But there was also this, in my late teen years going into college, I kind of wanted, it didn't necessarily come from my parents. I'm not sure where it came from, because they always followed their passion. They were always, money, business wasn't necessarily a concern. It was like, let's do the right thing, and let's be passionate, and the universe will provide. But I think there was some element of, I don't know if it was fear or safety. I remember somebody saying, show business has two parts, show and business. And for whatever reason, I interpreted the business side of, I should probably, understand the other part of this. If in any way it'll be a part of my journey. And I think just the business part kind of overtook. There was also a period too where I just really liked computers. So like early programming, Commodore 64, like that thing. And that became a lot of my early entrepreneurial pursuits, just technology stuff, like well before, internet and web browsers, which eventually became, a big part of at least a decade of my life, just being on the tech side of all things. And some of my first exits and first businesses were around technology. So yeah, I loved computers too. And that was another thing. It's like, okay, well, I like business and I really like computers. So started spinning up my first forays into that. But to answer your question, yeah, there was some moment where I'm like, I gotta know this stuff too. And then I'll get back to the show maybe, or maybe the show, or something like that.
Yeah. And it might have, just even been unconscious to some degree. I just was kind of curious, and your answer, like you knew you loved it. That's kind of, good enough. I mean, I wondered if, you saw your dad as a suit then, if there was some like, well, I better do what he's doing. But tell me, what actually are you doing? Where do you go with this? Now you put theater on the back burner and you're going forward with the business side of things. I mean, and when is this? Like, are in high school, college? Where are you kind of as you're, starting to explore business?
Yeah, it was probably later, certainly by college, but probably later high school. I had the fortune of going to 3 different high schools, 2 in Chicago. One was a Chicago public high school. Did that for 2.5 years. Kind of got bored with it, but I was like, got to be another angle of education. No discredit to the Chicago public school system, but I don't know if I learned much when I was there. So an opportunity arose to go to a prestigious private school. So then I transferred to a private school. And just, I think I learned more in that single semester at that private school than I had learned in all of my education combined. Just the profundity.
What was it that was, what was catching you?
It's just the quality of the teaching that a lot of my fellow classmates, had been going there since kindergarten. So it's just like the first paper we had to write was on the New Deal. And I just remember being in the class with like 20 other people who all became friends and still participating in like high school reunions and whatnot. And I was just like, how are these like high schoolers? These should be like, each one could have written a book, and they were just so articulate. And I mean, just some of the most educated and privileged, people in the world. Is the sons and daughters of, it was a prestigious private school. So I really opened up to that, but had that experience and said, okay, now I got this. And then I asked my parents, so we had visited Ghana a couple years previously. I met my dad there. He was consulting at the time. I kind of bummed around with him. It just really fell in love with West Africa, but specifically Ghana. And I remember saying, hey, do you guys mind if I finish high school in Ghana? And they're like, of course, Peace Corps parents, pretty open. I'm like, sure, here's a one-way ticket and $2,000. Good luck, kid. So I finished high school in Ghana, where, a couple weeks into Ghana International School, which is a British school system, the headmistress's assistant, who I became friendly with, said, are you planning to go to Oxford? And I'm like, probably not. Like, probably going to go to a theater school or something, or maybe some liberal arts college. And she's like, well, between you and me, you don't really have to finish. I'm like, what do you mean? Like, we can create a transcript that's Form 5. And I was doing Form 6, and Form 5 is closer to like a senior in America. And I'm like, really? I'm like, let's do it. So I still hung out because I was living with a Ghanaian family. Actually, this guy I met on the street. I was 17, and when I landed in Accra, I stayed at a hotel, the Sumpsui Inn. And a friend I had made previously, this Indian kid, Ravi, I remember. It's like, oh, you could just crash here. And the parents took me in. And about a month into that, there's this guy playing the flute. And I went up to him and I'm like, hey, nice job. And he goes, hi, who are you? And I'm like, oh, I'm Simeon. He's like, well, where do you live? I'm like, I live at that hotel. He's like, well, you want to come over for dinner? So I went to his compound, and he was living with, 30 close relatives in this big compound that often didn't have electricity or running water. And they invited me to move in with him, and he gave me his bedroom. So my senior year was living with this Ghanaian family, learning the language and the culture. But I'd go back to school because I'd get homesick for Western things. And it was an international school. So I knew the daughter of a diplomat would always say, hey, why don't you come over for dinner? So I'd go back to school for a few reasons. One, to get good meals. Two, I didn't really have to, participate much in the last year. So I started writing for the school newspaper. There was an advice column called Uncle Agony. And it was like relationship advice. But I was the bi-weekly column that's called Uncle Agony. And had co-writers in there, which is great because I just reconnected with one of my co-writers from back then who just left a few years ago to take over for Ariana Huffington. at the Huffington Post, and she's just
That's
left. But
great.
it's like she was a writer back then, and she just kept on that track. And like a couple years ago, I was like, "What? What her? Like you're what?" I was just, one of my best friends from high school in Africa. So I did the paper, and I produced plays with the British Council Players. So I got to direct, and I was in a play with her and her brother, I remember, and other plays. But it was really just one of the most amazing years because I had a 550 AT Yamaha motorcycle, and I'd be able to jump on my bike. And you know what? I'm going to go to Nigeria today. I'm going to go to Ivory Coast today. And it was just all pre-cell phone, so there wasn't that connectivity to the rest of the world or checking my email. But yeah, I spent a lot of time in villages and drumming circles and just having a lot of fun. So anyway, I can't remember the origin of this original question.
Yeah, well, that's okay. You know what's interesting to me, and I kind of have some envy over what I hear is this like real freedom. I mean, you have these Peace Corps parents who aren't afraid that their son is, in Ghana. And, you're on a motorcycle and you're exploring and you're, it sounds like really pretty free and like amazing, interesting, exciting. Like, is that what life was like for you? I mean, what a wonderful time in life.
It absolutely was. It's one of my most cherished, year and a halves of my life. It was just, depending on the perspective, I'll share that story with others. And it could be like, yeah, it's amazing and wow, what an experience. And others would be like, what kind of parenting was that?
Right.
Like, how naive were your parents to trust that, technically, 17, alone in West Africa with, so yeah, there's a double-edged sword to that type of parenting. There was great freedom, but, there wasn't a lot of, I don't want to say there wasn't supervision. But I didn't have a lot of the same rules I remember as like, there was never like even swearing. Like I never like, okay, if you want to swear, you could swear. So I chose not to because I was allowed to. It's like you could come home whenever you want, no curfew. So I was always home on time. You don't have to finish, your meal. So I finished my meal. I don't think they were doing reverse psychology, but if they were really good at it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, as a parent, you kind of, grow an appreciation for your parents, but you can also kind of realize just how hard it is to get it exactly right. Oh, do we give them freedom? Oh, do we give them too much freedom? It's a tough balance to get right. But in your case, what happens? You've got this kind of freedom. You're exploring life. You're creating, writing. Tell me, where do you go from here?
Yeah, immediately after Ghana, I was already into a bunch of like mystical consciousness stuff starting in, freshman year. So when I landed in Ghana, I met the head of TM, Transcendental Meditation. And he kind of took me under his wing, this guy, Nipadi. And what a great, amazing dude. He had like this little garden right on the ocean. And he kind of took me through TM. And I just really got into it and kind of took me through it to a point where he probably wasn't supposed to share all the teachings. But I was so into that. And again, it was, my senior year. I didn't have any responsibilities. I was, doing yoga several hours a day. I was, probably easily 100 pounds lighter, healthy, happy. And I said, well, it's really not university here. I should probably go to college. So the first college I went to, which lasted about a week, was Maharishi International University in Fairfield, Iowa.
Sure, yeah.
And I went there because I was, really close with Nee, who had just some. There were these times where I'd be hanging out with other people, and they'd be like, "What'd you do last night?" And I was like, "Oh, Nee came over for dinner," and they're like, "Well, what time?" And I'd say the time, they're like, "Well, that's impossible because he was at my place for dinner." And then it'd be like a third person at the table saying, "Well, he was also at my place for dinner." So I never got to the bottom of it, but the guy was pretty, like, some crazy magic at a whole other level. I don't know if he actually replicated but it happened on a number of times. So I'm like, well, this is kind of crazy. Let me dig into this a little more. But when I got there, the provost was basically like, well, you can't take these classes. I'm like, well, I already know all this stuff. So I just want to learn to levitate. And he's like, no, that's like, 6 years down. He's like, well, he probably shouldn't have given you all these teachings. So I don't know what to do. I think at that point I started I met his daughter, and that didn't go well. In fact, he was not happy about that. Who was also like leading a theater group there. And anyway, within a week, I was like, this isn't right. And actually, my dad, I remember, drove in. He was elated. He thought it was a little too cultish. There was still open enrollment for Columbia College Chicago. And so I started Columbia College Chicago, the largest film and theater school in the world, which had also had a lot of teachers who were not just teaching, theory, but actually working in the industry, and specifically the Second City, big improv theater in Chicago, which I had been training at. It was my first job there, washing dishes with, guys like John Favreau and Farley and Steve Colbert and Carell, who were just coming up. I was, a young teen. But I love that. I love the improv side. And then eventually, taught there for about 7 years and all that. But Columbia College was the one place where if you wanted to do anything around improv, that's it. That was like really one of the only schools that had such close proximity to comedy writing, to improv, et cetera. And it was around college I really got into the computer stuff, and then created a major for two reasons. One, the major was two things I really liked: theater and academic computing, or computers. But I also was reading a scholarship that had this provision that they would award one scholarship to each department. So I was reading the fine print, and I was like, wait a minute. Does this work for interdisciplinary majors? Well, no one's ever really tried to submit. So I thought, well, what two departments would never coexist? Kind of a shoo-in to get the scholarship. And it was the theater department and academic computing. And my major became computer-controlled multimedia for the stage, in which I really got into the computer side of it. One of my first businesses was an internet business. So it's really like around freshman year was the kind of the business side of things. And then, of course, what I'm doing now, which is, primarily, venture capital, specifically around the, burgeoning mushrooming industry of psychedelics. I started planting a lot of seeds, even back in high school, and just reading as much as I could and having the great, exposure to some of the great, Psy OGs that had been doing a lot of the research and clinical trials and protocols, previous to the Controlled Substances Act. So there's always kind of been a theatrical, a business, an appreciation of different, levels of consciousness. But yeah, if I look back, I don't know if there's a rhyme or reason why I'm, on this podcast right now. It all seems pretty random.
Yeah, right. But, I don't think it is. Tell me a little bit more about kind of the psychedelic aspect, the plant medicines, the psychotherapy, the kind of passion for mental health, and the kind of curiosity around consciousness, call it what you want. Tell me a little bit more about how that comes into your life in a significant way.
Yeah, it came in shortly after, probably the last day I was, I guess I'm always Jewish, but it happened around my bar mitzvah. I remember going through this ritual and just not, full appreciation for the tradition and all world religions for the most part. But I was like, the rhetoric of this stuff talks about spirituality and mysticism and, started even back then reading Kabbalah texts and the Merkaba mystics. But for whatever reason, just never met a qualified teacher in that tradition. So somewhere around 13, 14, after the pomp and circumstance of this ritual, becoming a man, I started to look for deeper reason, deeper meaning, greater purpose, Telemachus, the idea of telos, and probably found two books in the basement. They're in storage. One was Baba Ram Dass's, Richard Alpert's The Only Dance There Is, which is a little more obscure, and another paper written by John C. Lilly, who's a great, great scientist and researcher who did a lot with altered states of consciousness. It's now a pretty old movie, but the movie Altered States, starring William Hurt, I think it won some award, probably in the early 80s. It was that was John C. Lilly, who introduced sensory deprivation and float tanks and interspecies communications, to do a lot of ketamine and LSD with dolphins. So anyway, I just stumbled upon these two pieces of literature, and I was like, what the hell is this? I hadn't read anything, nothing in my, leading up to the bar mitzvah provided any inkling that these other states of consciousness or happiness were remotely within reach. So yeah, those high school years were really, formative, and kind of, maybe that is why, now I can connect the dots from those days in high school with the early experimentation around meditation, a lot of molecules, being able to study with great teachers from, notable folks like Robert Masters and Gene Houston, who wrote the book Varieties of Psychedelic Experiences, to great Tibetan masters, to you name it. There was something around 13 or 14. It's there's got to be more to humanity. And of course, there was all, when we talk about mental health right now, it's all tied to something happening, whether it's psychologically or neurochemically or spiritually, whatever label you want. That was my kind of door opening to, also practicing compassion to some extent, which has led into where I'm at right now. I remember being at an Ibogaine conference about 7 years ago, and met with a clinic, and the guys were heart students of a great Tibetan master. And I'm like, why did you decide to do this? Ibogaine being a psychedelic that, or in the psychedelic family, I should say. Some have debates whether it's a psychedelic, but a natural plant medicine that really helps with addiction and certainly helps with detox and withdrawal, whether it's opioids, heroin, oxys, you name it. And I go, why'd you do this? And it was like, what could be a greater act of compassion than helping addicts? And I was just like, yeah, you can sit on your cushion and meditate and say these prayers, or you can actually do the work in the world. So as that was always very much a big part of my path of bodhicitta and helping others, and then just reflecting. Like, I'm happiest when and I think this is true of a lot of humanity, when you're helping somebody else. It's just something happens neurochemically there. So
yeah. Tell me, this is really fascinating because I want to kind of get to what you're doing now. And what's really obvious to me is that you are kind of in a similar way to how you started to shift out of theater into business. You found a way to really roll it all into one, where you're very much a businessman. I mean, you're a venture capitalist. You have a fund. There's, as much finance and economic modeling and all of the aspects of business in what you do and how you're evaluating other businesses, et cetera, et cetera. But, kind of like you created the major. And look, there's a lot of emphasis on the space right now, but you've been in it a long time. It does seem very much kind of a part of something that seems to make a lot of sense, that you take all of the experience that you had, living in Ghana, having Peace Corps parents, understanding theater and learning about, what is there to life, and exploring that, and studying with all the people you have, that you would pull that all together into what you're doing now. That to me, I mean, certainly, I'm just hearing, your story in 40 minutes, but it seems to make sense. Do you see it that way?
I don't know how conscious it was, but I do see it.
Sure.
Like, I mean, as I sit here right now, I'm kind of, I don't know, a kid in a candy shop. I get to sit in the middle of, two different segments. On the one side, there's, the molecules and consciousness and drugs, psychedelics, whatever you want to label that. And on the other side, it's capital markets and early stage entrepreneurship and investing. And it's like, I don't think I was consciously making this my current chapter, my current gig, because it didn't exist a few years ago. You couldn't do this, right? So I don't know, maybe just the stars align, but it is a place where, as I reflect and even listening to myself and trying to be somewhat objective, I go like, holy shit, this is like, I think I could be comfortable here.
Yeah.
For
totally.
Quite a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it probably isn't a conscious experience when it happens, but when you, whether you think it's, divine, or it's just like you're, have a resume that you're putting to use, whatever you believe, I believe it's more a part of a divine plan, but it's awesome. You're pulling it all together, and this kind of space does emerge. Let's talk about it a little bit, because I mean, I could talk to you for days about the psychedelic plants and the work that they do. And that part's, fascinating for me and has been incredibly beneficial in my own life. And I love, kind of how you said, like, you could sit on your mat, couch or whatever, or you could, help addicts. And like, boy, I don't think there is much greater work. There's a lot of great work to be done, but seeing people suffer like that and knowing you can help them is pretty powerful. So I guess that's kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about, is that yes, you're in business. Yes, there's all those business aspects, and there's money to be made. I mean, this is a space that arguably is like a gold rush. Who knows? But it's potentially massively transformative. And when that happens, there's a lot of money to be made, but there's also a ton of really powerful work that can be done, transformation that can happen, whether it's just one addict or it's like a society, right? So tell me a little bit about kind of what it's like to be able to, really lean in to do well, do good, and to kind of still be in a space that that has a lot of stigma around it, that many people are ashamed to talk about or critical of. Talk a little bit about kind of what it's like to be doing what you're doing.
Yeah, let me start with the stigma. It's definitely lessening. A good example would be a month or so ago, a great uncle, didn't quite understand what I was into. The majority of my life with the molecules or plant medicines, even cannabis. Read something in the New York Times about PTSD in vets. And he was like, "Oh, is that what you're doing?"
Right.
Hey, that's really cool. Good for you. From, even a month before that article hit, it would have been like, "Oh, is he still doing that drug thing?"
Right.
So like to get it from that, and I don't want to say he's, myopic, closed-minded, uber conservative, lives in the 50s, but I just did. So for someone like that to say, "Hey, good job.
Yeah.
In seeing this whole narrative that, there were these molecules and there were these modalities of healing people with great results. And then, like in the early 70s with the Controlled Substances Act, it was like, game over. So it's been, in this space, it's been dormant for 50 years. That's why a lot of people are calling it the Renaissance, the Psychedelic Renaissance. And you have this time in history where it's this perfect storm of not just more research, not just shifts in regulatory regimes, not just all the great efforts around cognitive liberty and what's called decriminalization, which is, happening at a rapid clip, not just across the US, but the world, but money. Money is really that last component. And there's contention around this. Some of these molecules and the healing that people have is so profound, and it kind of shakes them at their core and makes them question everything around our societal structure. And more times than not, money is viewed as a predatory, divisive, competitive, capitalistic entity. That being said, the last part of the perfect storm is the beginning of capital markets and the fact that, there's going to be people who make a lot of money. But as I, often reflect, I don't know why it's still in my head because I haven't watched it in 20 years, but I think it was Cabaret, Liza Minnelli, and the song "Money Makes the World Go Round." But it's like that's why there's so much attention right now. And I think if there was not that opportunity for capital markets, for profit, for scaling early stage companies around the psychedelic industry, there wouldn't be this renaissance. There'd be research. There'd be some regulatory shift, but this is, fuel on the fire or, water on the soil or whatever metaphor. So I think that's a really big reason you're seeing this now. And the stigma is shifting. It is that capital markets side of it. And, in my role, like what's the responsible, sustainable, honorable side of the energy of money? And there is one if your intentions are good. And it's not just about making money. But again, it's a title of VC. We are beholden to our mandate, which is investing in companies for LPs so that they can have a return on investment. It's not a charity. So there is going to be that component, but it is moving so fast. There's so many initiatives We started deploying capital specifically and exclusively in the quote unquote psychedelic domain at the end of 2019, thinking we'd, all right, this is going to be, 5-10 years, but finally there's enough signals. I don't think anyone expected, psychedelic companies on the NASDAQ, with many more about to announce. Capital markets, universities now having curricula with psychedelic in the title, regulators looking at, wait a minute, we have an opioid epidemic. Is there a way to cure this? We have massive depression and SSRIs, which accommodate $100 billion plus business, don't really do the job for the majority of the people. So it kind of feels like, although I've been waiting for this moment in a sense for a few decades, it's kind of like it just happened overnight. This acceptance. So the stigma is really lessening. And again, I'm so inside, it's hard for me to tell, but again, great uncle says, Hey, good job. It's like,
right.
That would be the guy who would be the worst critic. And he's now saying, oh, I get it. This is different. This isn't, recreational. This is healing people. And a lot of it's going to be medicalized. And it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. Do you worry that there could be so much attention, that it's happening so fast, that we could find ourselves in a situation again where there's some opposition that utilizes some, I don't know, tragedy or something to really shut it down again? I mean, do you think we're over the hump because there's people like your uncle and politicians and, the rumors of Musk and Branson and everyone else in Silicon Valley, doing, 5-MeO at lunchtime? Like, are we over the hump, or do we have a lot of danger still? I mean, and it kind of speaks a little bit to the money piece. This is why, I'm invested with you, and why a big part of why I wanted to be a part of what you're doing is because I believe you're the right kind of person to be doing this. Your intentions, back to your, qualifying criteria, I know are really good. And so you can do good and you can do well because your intentions, I know, from a character standpoint, are exactly where they should be. But that's probably not true for everybody. When you see on an episode of Billions that the hedge fund guys are talking about, fighting for the shaman, right? Like, this could get kind of messy and ugly. And, do you think we run the risk of this going the wrong way?
Well, certainly the jury is out. And that Billions episode was like, I've witnessed that already. Like, that was not fiction. That is, it was a writer, but I've seen that. I think there's so many different buckets and the perspectives around this. The majority of the money coming into the space is coming into the space under, the purview of acronyms like the DEA and the FDA. So it's a lot of the press is the medicalization. There was a provider over yesterday I was visiting with who just opened a few ketamine clinics here in New York. And he said something, it's like, it's real tricky business, medicalizing the mystical. And we started brainstorming. Like, I haven't heard anyone suggest that, but the majority of the companies you're seeing in the news you're reading, this is one bucket, is the medicalization. It's going through FDA trials. It's very biotech. It has to be approved. On the other hand, you're also seeing a groundswell around decrim in certain places saying, well, it's not legal and you can't buy it or you can't sell it, but if you're doing it, we're going to look the other way, or it's the least of our priority. And that's an area that needs to be monitored and supported, because cognitive liberty and decrim makes a ton of sense. And harm reduction. There's a few startups right now on the harm reduction front who are, good actors who are saying, it's the stuff in the New York Times and decrim. We don't want what happened in the past where someone, called Tim Leary the most dangerous man in the world. Like, we don't want that to happen again. So there has to be a level of engagement and buy-in from kind of all of humanity. And it feels like it's open enough or opening enough because of all the good stuff coming out of the research. When you meet a vet or you meet somebody who, is suffering an intractable, debilitating mental health disease and indication, and they're healed from this, like that spilling over into, there are the right ways to play with these, to administer these, to experience these molecules, whether it's the medicalization or an indigenous, millennial old setting and protocol. So, to answer your question, I don't know. I certainly hope not. But, these substances have been around for the last 50 years. And the reason they were scheduled, well, there's could be a 50-hour podcast on why, what happened in the early 70s around scheduling. But, it was around this fear about these being used incorrectly or people freaking out or having a bad trip. I feels like everything I'm reading in the media, the conversations I'm aware of now from, the front of the Wall Street Journal to 60 Minutes, is that there'll be a little more intelligence around this. And when I'm on the phone with anyone from the FDA and the DEA, it's a very different conversation because they know somebody, they themselves have suffered some mental illness. And with that, there's the support of it, and let's get it right. And we have one shot. I don't know if we necessarily have one shot, and I don't know if, the FDA path is the best one. On paper, it makes sense because it's the system we have, and it's the fastest way to get this to people. And you're starting to see that happen with, well, certainly ketamine, MDMAs, and psilocybin are kind of tied with MDMA a little further on, really just around PTSD, and psilocybin treating a whole bunch of other indications. But then, another 50 classical psychedelics right in tow that could help pacify and heal people.
Simeon, let me ask you, you have really gone deep into this space personally. You're looking at, I don't know how many deals, investments, where you're seeing the many ways people are coming at this. Even the decriminalization thing where, people are looking the other way. It worries me a little bit. I have a lot of people in my network. We're doing an event here with Rick Doblin, and it's a YPO EO event, and I'm just amazed at how many people are signing up, want to know, are interested, doing it, talking about it. I sometimes get a little uneasy because I have such a reverence for the work. I mean, I think it's really as spiritual as it gets, and it needs to be treated that way. And I guess, I probably can back out a little bit further and trust that there's no wrong and nothing's really bad and it's all happening in a divine plan. But I do think that the ego and human nature can get in the way, and the divine plan could take 5 years, or it could take 500 years, depending on kind of how we are with it, and so I guess my question I'm getting to is knowing that you've studied with indigenous cultures and really been deeply in places where this work is held with that reverence. Where do you suggest people start? I mean, I'm not somebody who generally likes to recommend psychedelics, despite the fact that I have such a passion for what they can do, because I think it's scary and dangerous, and you better damn well know what you're getting into and have the right support and integration and all the other pieces that you need around you, and be ready to not be able to unsee what you've seen. Where do you tell people to start, or how do you suggest people kind of from a healthy way enter into this space?
The answer will shift depending on who's asking. If it's someone who's going through, launch, any of the major indications, my recommendation is always finding qualified psychotherapists.
Mm-hmm.
Two, if you look at it, from two sides of the spectrum, at least the current dialogue around psychedelics, some will say, well, it can cure sickness or it can optimize wellness. So on, the optimizing wellness, a lot of people want to explore altered states of consciousness. They want that edge. Microdosing is, becoming ever popular. So it would depend on, the person and what they're trying to achieve. I think on the right side of the optimizing wellness and the use of psychedelics and the microdosing trend, an anecdote of a gentleman who was microdosing I talked to a year ago. It was for a brand, microdosing brand. And I said, so like, how's it been going? And he'd been microdosing for 7 months. He's like, I'm not sure, but my wife no longer thinks I'm an asshole. And just in that little clip, I was like, whoa, this guy was microdosing and self-perceptual. It didn't change anything else to his protocol, his diet, anything. And he just kind of, for him, that specific person, it made him a little kinder. And then he got into it, his work relationships. He's now being accused of being a better listener and not a bad boss and all these other good things. So it really depends on what the person is looking for. And if it's, an intractable mental health disorder or disease, then the route of, finding qualified people, I would say medicalization is kind of where it's going. But there's also the ability to sit in circles. And we're seeing a lot of that in the decrim movement. They're saying, hey, it's not just take these drugs, because you need that support, whether it's a shaman, psychiatrist, you need some container to process this. Like, the psychedelic doesn't make the change. It kind of opens up the possibility to make the change. And then it's a lot of hard work, on that former side. So it really depends. Obviously, you had mentioned some names, Rick and Matt's, and, I think all the nonprofits who have been following forever are always the greatest places to start, because it's usually informed. There's no bias about profit. So starting with the Beckleys, the Hefters, the Matts, just learning, seeing what they've been working on for the last decades is a really good start. You also have, about a half a dozen psychedelic media outlets that didn't even really exist up until the last couple of years, and or were really hard to find, that are becoming more prominent. And those are always great resources. And then I think the last, when people have questions, I'm still I delight in taking calls. It's like, hey, I have a question, making introductions. So, contacting me, I hope, I don't want to insult you, but I'm assuming there's 10 million listeners. I don't think I can accommodate 10 million emails, but, reaching out.
We're a little shy of that. So I think, it might be okay to at least put your website in the show notes. How about that?
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah. 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 Wonderful. Thank you, Simeon. Just as we wrap up, first of all, again, just to reemphasize, I really think the importance of whose hands this is in really matters. And I know that you and JLS are really focused on supporting the right people, and making sure this is done with integrity. And I think it's really incredible work, and it's very early in many ways, even though there's people like yourself and others who have been in the work for decades. This still feels like the beginning. So thank you for what you're doing and for taking some time to open up and share your story. Any final thoughts you want to share with the audience?
No final thoughts. Just an appreciation to anyone who's listening, and to you for hosting me. I mean, for me, it's been, I've never been in the closet around these things, but it hasn't been until the last couple of years I could fully open up about it. So thank you for providing yet another opportunity to just be open and honest. And this industry is millennia old, but also brand new. And just having a place in it is such a joy and a treat. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.